It was at that point that the bell began to ring. A rapid, high-pitched ringing noise that always signaled the beginning of the match, as the cages were automatically opened, the doors pulled by chains that would allow entry into the cage. So as all the cages had the doors lifted out of place, I stepped out of my cage, bars in hand, my eyes darting back and forth between the three other individuals now entering. They were all of fairly average build. Two of them began to look around, a bit scattered, looking somewhat frightened, which was a typical expression those who were new to the ring would have, questioning how far they'd be willing to go, weighing their value of their own lives against the possibility of taking someone else's. The entire situation pressing down on them for the first time. But one of them had no such hesitation. Without a second thought, his eyes immediately fell on me, more specifically the iron bars in my hands, and he took no time in starting to rush me, heading for me at a dash, hoping to tackle me and wrangle the bars out of my hands. Grease thought all of these guys were newbies, but someone else apparently tried throwing a ringer in. There was no way that guy was a fresh fish. The look on his face wasn't one of someone who had never seen the inside of a ring, who had been forced to play this little game of theirs, as twisted as it was. No, he knew exactly what he was doing, and had no questions about it. He wanted to live, and killing, well, that was just something he had to do in order to keep breathing. But luckily enough, I was no newcomer to this either. As he rushed in, I dodged to the right, swinging out with one of the iron bars in my hands. I aimed for his head, but unfortunately he blocked, bringing his arm up. As the iron bar impacted, I could feel it. He wasn't very big, but he had strong muscles. He wasn't just skin and bones. He was fairly toned under all of those rags, and experienced enough to see the hit coming and block. Yeah, a hit from an iron bar will hurt like hell, even from a 10-year-old. But it's not fatal. You'll live. If you can bear the pain, ignore it for the time being, let the adrenaline work for you, force your way through it, then all it really adds up to is a hit. I don't pack enough wallop to shatter bone in people 3 times my size, easily. So even if I swung as hard as I could, my hits weren't going to be debilitating unless I hit something vital, something that would majorly slow them down. I needed a headshot. Otherwise, it would just hurt like hell. Quick enough to make it obvious that that wasn't the first hit he had taken. He backed off, just enough to try to brace himself from the pain for a moment, thinking over the best way to get at me. But now, I had another problem. Having to dodge him had forced me into the center of the ring, with my back to the 2 other competitors. At the moment, they were looking on, but that fresh fish feeling doesn't last that long. Eventually, the fear and the adrenaline takes over. The desire to live begins to surpass your fear of killing very rapidly. It only really lasts a few moments. Once that fades, they'll start to fight. In the center of the ring with my back to 2 others, I was too much of a target. So I rapidly began to try to shuffle my way over, making my way towards the cage that the clearly more experienced individual came out of, taking his place, as he tried to move his arm around, working the pain out. It was at that point the first of the 2 actual fresh fish got over their little bit of anxiety. Luckily enough, The adrenaline hadn't pushed him to the point where attacking a kid seemed like the best or the most moral option. He still hadn't been pushed that far yet. It was obviously the smart choice. I have the weapons. Take me, take the weapons, take the weapons, take the match. But they hadn't been twisted by this ring yet. Hadn't been made to think of everything in cold strategic, victory and survival above all else. So he attacked the guy that I hit with the iron bar, heading for him, hoping that he just wouldn't have to be the one to deal with me. And the other guy finally started to come around, coming out of the first time daze. He still had fear in his eyes as he saw the other individual start to dart for the one that I hit with the iron rods. It was at that point that his eyes fell on me. He saw an opportunity. Clearly those two were going to fight, and while they were occupied, he could get the weapons. He still looked afraid, but he headed for me all the same. He was being compelled by the fear of death. He wanted to leave the ring. He wanted to survive. And with the more experienced fighter looking like he would be occupied, this was his opportunity. He came after me, more cautiously than the first one, approaching to within a few feet, but keeping his distance, trying to corner me somewhat. But he didn't really have that much fighting experience, so he found it difficult to try to corner me. A few times he tried bolting to one side or the other, try to use his size to press me. But whenever he did, I'd just counter with one of the iron bars, striking him on the arm or the leg, giving myself enough room to roll or squeeze through. Finally, perhaps luckily for me, between the pain of getting hit with the iron bars and the ticking clock of knowing that eventually that other fight would run out, and perhaps a little bit of frustration for not being able to corner me, he took a dive at me, a reckless one, hoping that he could pin me, take the bars. But as he dived at me, I dived at him, just underneath, sliding underneath his tackle. And before he could get back up, I was on him. The first swing he caught, grabbing my arm, immediately trying to wrench the iron bar from my grasp. But I still had one free arm and one iron bar, so it didn't take more than a hit to break away one of his arms, which left his head exposed. The first hit dazed him. As the impact struck, his grip on me loosened. But after another 2 hits, he went out cold, stopped moving, finally releasing his grasp on me altogether and laying flat on the ground. I began to try to pick myself up, turn my attention to the other fight in the ring, but before I could, I was struck exceptionally hard. At the time, I really couldn't tell what he hit me with, only that it hurt and that it was in the head. My entire world went topsy-turvy for a few moments, as I couldn't really make heads or tails of anything. I could tell that I wasn't on top of the other guy anymore. I had been knocked away, thrown somewhere else across the ring, and now there was blood draining from my head. He hit me very hard. My eyes were still having trouble focusing, but not surprisingly, it was the more experienced fighter. Apparently, I had taken too long. He managed to clear his opponent before I did, and struck out with a surprise attack. Before I could get my bearings and start to move, I felt another impact. This time it was a kick, right to my sternum, which sent me sliding across the ring into the cage. I heard a very unpleasant cracking sound as a sharp stabbing sensation shot into my chest. He most likely broke one of my ribs, at least. Once again, before I could really move or react, he was already there. He clasped onto the iron bars in my hands, trying to rip them away. I, of course, tried to hold on, but another solid kick to the midsection robbed me of my strength, and my breath for that matter, as I found myself coughing up blood, and he ripped the bars from my hands. And there he stood, towering over me, catching his breath for a moment as he looked down at me. The look on his face wasn't one of joy or excitement. I could see it there. He knew what he had to do in order to survive. He knew what was required of him. But for a moment, he stood over looking at me, and I could see it. That shame in his eyes, as for a moment he felt the moral weight of what he was doing, of what he had to do, and he was not a fan of it. This wasn't an act of enjoyment. He wasn't some sick maniac who simply loved hurting others. No, he still had some morality in there, some humanity. He just wanted to live, no different than I wanted to live. A pained expression came over his face as he raised one of the hands carrying the iron bar overhead. And it was at that point that I knew that it was game over. Lights out for me. I had played the hand that I was dealt and lost. And now I was going to die. And there wasn't really anything that I could do about it. It was at that point that I was saved by an explosion that erupted from a side wall of the ring that they had built there. The entire wall exploded inward as some sort of armored vehicle smashed through it, running over several people. Pieces of stone flying everywhere, debris and dust, and almost immediately an entire team of men in armor swept out of the vehicle, all armed to the teeth with weaponry, who began firing on everyone. Energy weapons, solid-state weapons, regardless of what kind they were wielding, they were killing everyone. It was a smattering of bright light and blood. The man in the ring with me dropped the iron bars and collapsed to the ground, trying to stay low, wondering exactly what was going to happen next.